Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm sure we'll have a few additional folks come on as we move along, but for the sake of time, I want to go ahead and get us started. Thanks for joining us for this is the latest edition of our webinar series. I see a lot of names that I recognize as well as a lot of new folks, so welcome. My name is Lewis Miller and I'm the Assistant Director of HDO. Today we are joined by Dr. Ken Wisian, a research scientist and the Director of the Disaster Research Program at the Center for Space Research here at UT Austin. Dr. Wisian is here to discuss a very timely topic, leading during a crisis. He will begin with an introduction and overview of his approach to crisis leadership and management based on timeless principles and illustrations from ancient Greece to present events and experiences from his decades of military, governmental, and educational service. A few notes before we get started. Please mute your microphone and turn off your video during Dr. Wisian's presentation. If you have any pressing issues or questions during the session, feel free to send me or any other HTO staff member a private chat. I'll now turn things over to Dr. Wisian, and I hope you guys enjoy the session.
Okay, thank you, Lewis. I appreciate it. Welcome, everybody. Hope everyone's safe and sound today, and we will get going. So, the scene, 401 BC in ancient Persia, modern-day Iraq and Iran area. 10,000 Greeks, who were considered to be the best infantry in the world at that time, were hired by Cyrus the Younger to participate in a battle for control of the Persian Empire. At that point, the largest empire in the world. So they were hired as mercenaries. Unfortunately, in the first big battle, Cyrus was killed and his army fell apart except for the Greeks, who held their formation and couldn't be toppled. The victorious Persians invited the Greek leadership to a meeting to discuss peace terms. But when they arrived, they were captured and killed, leaving the Greeks leaderless. So they formed up, heard speeches by various members of their units on what courses of action they should take. And based on that, they elected new leadership, one of which was Xenophon. Xenophon was an Athenian, a young aristocrat, historian, soldier, mercenary. He'd been a student of Socrates. With the new leadership, over a period of months, they managed to fight their way back to their homeland of Greece through hostile territory and with the Persian army hot on their heels and engaging them at any chance. In that time, Xenophon emerged as a truly versatile and innovative leader. At times, he would lead by cajoling his men into action. Many other times, he would lead the charge into battle personally. He also proved to be an adroit diplomat, a sound strategic thinker, and quite a military innovator in tactics. What you have here is the emergence of a great leader during a crisis. And in particular, I like this as a starting point because think about it. You're looking back to almost 2,500 years in history at some of the earliest recorded thorough military histories written. And you're seeing the same examples of what is good leadership, what is bad leadership, of innovation, of crisis management over the longest possible span of recorded history. And I think that perspective is a vital starting point towards building your own leadership framework. The fact that yes, technology changes, but leadership, human nature, politics, none of that has changed for as long as recorded history has been around. So today, we'll be talking about crisis leadership with a good starting slogan of don't panic. And I'll explain a little bit more behind that in a bit. Welcome all. The target for this talk, the target audience is really anyone in a leadership position, from business to government leaders to heads of household. There's leadership exercised in all situations day to day. But in this new reality that we're in, many people are finding themselves in new situations without training. And so that's who I really want to focus on today. But at the same time, hopefully even a very experienced and confident leader will find something new they can take away from this talk. I'll mix, as you can see, anecdotes from literature, from popular media, and some from my own personal experiences. Key to my outlook on this is that leadership, including crisis leadership, is learned. I don't believe there are natural leaders, although many people are called natural or born leaders. If you look carefully at their history, you'll find early experiences that shaped them, that taught them leadership. There's a common misperception, I think, that flashy, larger than life people are natural leaders, but that's wrong on multiple counts. As I stated, look at these born leaders and look at their history in detail. And maybe it's from their parents, maybe it's early sports or other type of experiences that shaped them as leaders, but they still learned in some way or another. Being an extrovert does not correlate with good leadership necessarily. Every type of personality has both strengths and weaknesses as a leader. There is no one best type of personality. But the key is you don't have to be large as such, although that's perfectly okay. But many of the best leaders in history, and some of the ones I look up to the most, were relatively quiet and most likely introverts. People like Lincoln, U.S. Grant, or Omar Bradley. If you look around today at current events, you can see good and bad leadership being displayed every day at multiple levels. Some fields are particularly vulnerable to poor leadership, in my personal experience, and no offense intended here, but academic and doctors, very well educated people, can sometimes not realize their own weaknesses or what a lack of training means to them. So as we get going, first of all, please ask questions at any time. You can ask in chat or audio as necessary. If I lapse into jargon, because I'm coming at this with most of my adult life spent in the military, I've tried to take the jargon out of this, except for a couple of key instances. But if I lapse into jargon that's not commonly known, let me know, please. But no matter who you are, what your background is, just plowing ahead and taking small steps, you can really surprise yourself at what you can accomplish in leadership, even if at the moment you feel overwhelmed. So from this starting of looking back as far as we can in history, let's take a look at something totally different. And I'm not sure why that's showing up small, but let me see what I can do on this. Okay, so maybe I made your head spin going from 2,500 years before the present to a modern YouTube clip of a brother and sister talking during the night in bed. But this gets to my point that I'll make throughout today, which is there are leadership examples that you can learn from all around you day in, day out, not just from classic literature or movies. So take a moment and think about what you were just looking at here. What'd you see? I saw fluid handoff between leader and follower roles. I saw constant communication and specifically good closing of communication loops, not just sending a message, but ensuring it's being received and understood in that back and forth banter on a topic. I saw delegation and good follow through. I also saw a good SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in assessing resources, where Vivi assessed the resources she needed, including a stool and her brother. So a really almost too cute, charming example of modern day leadership in an area where you might not think to look for it. Okay, hold on just a second here. I'm getting another message. My audio on the video is not coming through, so I've got to go to another area to set that. Just a second, bear with me.
I'm also going to post a link to the audio, to the video in the chat so folks can access it there too.
Okay. And oh, this is a definite issue here. It was working yesterday, but I don't see the button I need. That was on, oh, there. Audio. No. And Miles, if you can give me a handout on cluing me in back to where that was.
Yeah, if you go to the top of your screen, where you see that you're sharing your screen, there should be
that's okay. So
yeah.
let me stop share. Miles, keep talking for me.
Yeah, so on the bottom where it says share screen,
Okay.
you can go ahead and share your screen, and then at the top there should be an option
There it is.
yeah.
Share computer sound. My apologies, folks. We're all still learning the zoom in and outs here. So that should work the next time we get to it. So let me go back to full screen.
Yep.
Okay. So let me back up here. Okay, that's where that was. So I'm not going to play that again. Okay, so this seminar. This seminar is just barely 2 hours of time. This is a triage. It's meant to put you in a good position to start building your own holistic perspective and framework for your leadership. My goal is to do this as a public service, again, for folks who find themselves in a new experience now, and to provide you with that starting point. I'm not going to spoon feed you. You'll get a big dose of my leadership approach today and what I view as some of the more significant issues in leadership. And that will hopefully serve as an important data point in building your own approach. But leadership is unique to yourself. I strongly disagree with folks who come in and tell you, no, this is the way to be a leader. Do this, this, and this. And they give you a very formalistic approach. You know, I come from a military background, mostly Air Force, but my experiences have shaped how I lead. Someone who spent their career, for instance, in the infantry would come out with a very different approach, more than likely. You have to take samples from a variety of sources and distill those into your own leadership principles and guidance. Leadership is not rocket science. Most of it is simply doing the right thing, which comes naturally to most people. It's providing a steady, honest example for people to follow. That leadership by example is perhaps one of the most crucial parts of this. Crisis leadership, specifically, gets probably closer to a combat situation than any other civil situation. And in a crisis, good leaders grow or emerge. You have to watch out for that on your own and for your subordinates. So the flow today. The flow will be in two main parts. The first half, I'll talk about leadership principles, what I consider to be the significant foundational building blocks. The second half, we'll look at crisis leadership from a time sequence perspective, going through the preparation, response, recovery, and review or mitigation phases of a crisis. So a very large picture time-wise of what a crisis is, not just the actual crisis as such. Time permitting, we'll also get into some recommendations for further self-study, or selfie as I'll call it here, using literature, books, and people and situations around you. I also want to specifically credit another HDO faculty and professor of philosophy, Paul Woodruff, who I met last year, who really added another significant aspect to my own view on leadership, because I'm always still looking to learn. And while I've been a student of history my whole life, I hadn't appreciated the value that examples in classic fictional literature can bring to the leadership picture and your own understanding. And I credit Paul Woodruff for putting me back on track for that new and rather exciting aspect of leadership that I'm learning even today. So, a little bit about me, just so you know where I'm coming from and so you can understand what my perspective is. I come at this, first of all, I am an academic, but not in this field. I'm a physicist by training. I bring a very operational or user perspective to leadership because I've been a practitioner for most of my life in mostly formal and sometimes informal roles. My experiences have shaped me and provided me with many examples. I'll only scratch the surface of great examples in today's talk. I've led large and small organizations into the many thousands of airmen and civilians in both peacetime, war, and in disaster responses, particularly here in Texas. Besides participating in 3 wars, I'm a graduate of the Air Force Test Pilot School and have some very interesting and exciting hours of high-risk test flights behind me too. In civilian government, post-military, I also had broad responsibilities, including disaster recovery for the state of Texas and billions of dollars of budgetary authority. So it's not just the military world, it's also civilian. Although you'll notice I said disaster recovery, not disaster response, which later on I'll get to some of the differences there. So that's a brief summary on my background, but, and this gets back to my point about building your own framework. Don't just listen to me. I'm just one perspective. And that perspective is just what works for me and the lessons I've learned. But you need to build your own framework and leadership style. Get multiple perspectives, as many as you can, from people, from literature, from movies, and distill that into your own style. And I say that bearing in mind that, for instance, as you'll see in a little while, I'm a very introverted, nerdy person. what works for me may not work at all for a very different personality type. And that's again why I say that there is no one style of leadership to be successful. A few terms before we dive in. Naturally, what is a crisis? And there are many academic definitions of all these terms, but to me, it's simply a crisis, which you could also call an emergency or disaster. I'll use those terms pretty much interchangeably today. But the key thing about a crisis is that you have limited time and the stakes are high. That's a crisis to me. Now, bear in mind, as we saw in the earlier video, if you're a 2-year-old, your immediate need for your binky may be a crisis to you. So it's all a matter of perspective. But in a crisis, it's the time compression that really makes things difficult and changes it from your normal day-to-day leadership style. In leadership versus management, again, I look at that pretty simply. Leadership is about motivating people. Management is the larger picture of running an organization, which includes leadership, but much more than that. A note on the introvert-extrovert perspective. Yes, those terms are gross generalizations of personalities, but they're useful just as a contrast mechanism when we go through here. And from my personal perspective, I think that's one of the bigger aspects of people that shapes their leadership style. You'll also see throughout here that there are no hard boundaries on any of the topics I talk about. Whether you're talking about the principles, which one feeds back in on another, so you can't cleanly separate them, or the phases of a disaster, where the boundary between response and recovery may be pretty blurry. So let's talk about principles. The first is don't panic. And at some point, I'd be curious to find out how many of you recognize the reference here. In my case, the image and my use of the term don't panic, which is pretty common, but is specifically from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This is a classic 1980s science fiction comedy that has as a key feature of it a Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Think a futuristic version of a Lonely Planet guidebook or Frodo's or something like that. On the cover of this book, the number one thing it says, and the only thing it says, is don't panic. That's a great starting point for any situation. Easier said than done, but a great starting point. Staying calm in a crisis and as a leader is vitally important. People cue off their leaders at whatever level you are at. If you're a parent, you already know that your parents cue off you. How many times does a little one trip and fall and then look at you before deciding whether to laugh or cry? It's no different if you're leading a multinational corporation. People cue off you. Maybe they can't see you all the time, but they cue off your actions. Panic and despair are highly, highly contagious. In military terms, an army doesn't rout until panic sets in. Military defeat is rarely the cause of a rout of an army. It's usually maybe defeat of a small part of the army or whatever cause. It could just be a rumor that causes panic to start in one small part and race through an army and lead to a rout. And by the way, more people die in a rout than they do in the combat leading up to it. So what I'm saying is, as much as humanly possible, you need to keep calm and keep putting one foot in front of the other. And we'll come back to how building your leadership framework can help you achieve that. Because I realize it's easier said than done. And again, many people outside, if you're not coming from a military background or perhaps from a business school background, you may never get any formal training on leadership, and let alone crisis leadership. So it's not unusual to be going, okay, what do I do now? So principles build on your core values. Nothing should contradict your core values. And in this area, it's something I just blatantly still use from the Air Force. Now, the Air Force and the military aren't perfect. I could rant for hours about what's wrong with the military and the Air Force in particular, but on core values, they nailed it. The Air Force core values are integrity first, service before self, and excellence in all we do. And the image here is my coin as a 2-star general, my challenge coin, with my units and my flag on it. But in particular, notice the words here, the first words of each of those core values on my coin, as a way to communicate to people that that's what I value. What are yours? What are your organizations? There shouldn't be any strong divergence between yours or your organizations. In my case, it's easy because I adopted the Air Force core values. But anytime you're lost, you go back to your first principles or core values like these, and then build up from there in order to help you make the decisions that need to be made. Core values should be succinct, and you should be able to rattle them off, as I just did. If you have to think about them, they're not a part of your core being. Okay, from building up from that, what are my leadership guiding principles, I'll call them? These are the things that as a commander, I've always borne in mind in approaching leading an organization. Every military person has these, every CEO has a set of them. They're usually in 3s. I'll give you mine. And the first line of that is take care of people and get the mission done. Sometimes people place these on separate lines. I deliberately place them actually on the same line because you have to keep them in balance. That's a factor that gets overlooked. For an organization to work successfully over the long haul, both these things have to be done. The people have to be maintained, and you have to get the mission done. You fail in either one of these, and your business or your organization fails. Yes, particularly in a crisis or emergency, you may have to put the mission above the people briefly. But when the emergency is over, what do? Okay, you give people extra leave or vacation time or something, not necessarily a monetary reward, at least not just that, because that doesn't recharge people's psyche. The downtime does. So balance in these. But even in the midst of a crisis, you can do this on a smaller scale. So yes, your people are working 24/7 to design a new ventilator. But coming in, seeing who's really stressed out or rubbing their eyes, telling, hey, go take 30 minutes to get a nap in the back office. Those little things are an important part of keeping the balance going, even in the midst of a crisis. Be safe. People are often surprised to hear that even in combat, there are safety standards, but there are. They may be relaxed because the situation is different, the risks are higher, but there are still safety standards. If you're doing a close air support bombing run to help out a unit on the ground, there's a limit to how close you can aim your bombs to friendly forces because there's inaccuracies in the bombs, because the explosion pattern extends a certain distance. That's called danger close, is that limit. If you have to go in closer than that, it has to be on the commander on the ground's call that yes, we're being overrun, we desperately need it, I accept the risk. But there are those standards, and there's clear protocols for how to go beyond different sets of standards in those conditions. Tying these first two things together, as a leader, your first responsibility is to the safety and security of your people. Even that goes even underneath taking care of people, foundational to that. It's your responsibility to provide them with the resources they need, with yourself last, to make sure they're safe in doing their job. There's an example of that going on now, which I only know the brief headlines I've read, and I hope this isn't true, but the headline was that the IRS wants its own people to bring their own mask and safety gear in when they report to work. That would be a monumental failure of leadership if that's the case. That should be a last-ditch effort. You as a leader are responsible for the safety and equipping of your people. The last aspect is have fun. I really enjoyed saying this as a colonel and a general in the military because it usually caught people by surprise to hear the old guy talking about, hey, let's have fun. But a moment of levity does wonders for morale. And just in general, if you're not looking forward to coming into work most days, something's wrong and you need to do something about it. But in a crisis situation, there's still time for humor. Make the time. Even a tiny bit can just totally change the picture and the energy levels. Leading by example. That's probably the most commonly cited trait that leaders say is important, that people who write biographies of leaders say is important. As I already mentioned, you are watched constantly as a leader, whether you realize it or not, you are. And one moment of inconsistency can absolutely cripple you. You have to be consistent in your actions. You have to be honest. I don't think trying to pretend to be superhuman works. No one is superhuman, and everyone does make mistakes. But here's where you get a key difference, I think, between good leadership and bad leadership. Good leaders own their mistakes and own the mistakes of their subordinates. You are the filter on the proverbial stuff rolling downhill. At the same time, you never take credit for the success of your organization. You pass it on. Doing those things builds your credit with your people. And let me give you an example here. There's a couple of pictures on the screen here. This is, at this point in the photo, Major Penny, but at the time she was Lieutenant Heather Penny, call sign Lucky, shown also here in combat in Iraq. Also here is Lieutenant Colonel Mark Sasseville. They were Washington, D.C. Air National Guard members. He's the unit commander. She's a brand new fighter pilot on 9/11, on the day of 9/11. So let me read you a little bit from a story that was written about their experience on the morning of 9/11. They show up. It's a normal training day for them. This is a unit that trains for combat, just like all military units, day in, day out. They do not have a what's called strip alert or fighter alert mission. So they don't have, and they fly F-16 fighters, but they don't have any armed and ready to go. At that point, there was nothing around DC that was ready to defend. They're coming in for a normal day of just training practice missions. Obviously, the news breaks that one plane has hit the World Trade Center. Okay, that's interesting. Then a second one hits. Okay, now something's going on. People start scrambling. A third plane hits the Pentagon. And almost at once, word came that a fourth plane could be on the way, maybe more. The jets would be armed in about an hour. But somebody had to fly now, weapons or no weapons. Colonel Mark Sasseville comes in to the ready room where the pilots are and says, Lucky, meaning Lieutenant Penny, Lucky, you're coming with me. They were gearing up in the pre-flight life support area, putting on flight suits and helmets, when Sasseville met her eye and said, I'm going for the cockpit. She replied without hesitating, I'll take the tail. It was a plan and a pact. Let's go, he said. Penny had never scrambled a jet before. Normally, the pre-flight is a half hour or so of very methodical checks. She automatically started going down the checklist. Lucky, what are you doing? Get your butt up there and let's go, Sasseville shouted. She climbed in, rushed to power up the engines, and screamed for a ground crew to pull the chocks. The crew chief still had his headphones plugged into the fuselage as she nudged the throttle forward. He ran alongside, pulling safety pins from the jet as it moved forward. She muttered the fighter pilot's prayer, "God, don't let me F this up," and followed Sassenville into the sky. A little extra zinger is that Lieutenant Penny's father was a pilot on the same route as that last United Airlines flight. She didn't know if she was going up to intercept him or not. Now look at this from a leadership perspective. There is very little communication. Colonel Sassenville has obviously built up a lot of credibility with his folks. He simply pops into a room and says, "You're coming with me." And then his only other mission directive was, "I'm going for the cockpit." What he means there is they're going up with unarmed weapons. They've got nothing to shoot. So the only way they can take down this airliner, if they find it, is by ramming it. She didn't miss a beat saying, "Yes, I'll go for the tail." There is a world of information loaded in those two phrases, and an outstanding example of leadership and followership. Now let me switch gears radically here and tell you about a recent experience I had. You know, we're obviously under lockdown restrictions for the time being. So I went to pick up a load of groceries from curbside pickup from the Randalls on FM 620 north of town. I pull into the spot. There's a phone number on the sign there. You call it. I call it, and a woman standing outside to the left side of my car says, "Yeah, I'm right here. You know, what's your name? What's your order number?" She goes out. First, I should say that it's a woman roughly my age, maybe a little bit younger. She's a department manager, but she's the person out there working perhaps the most dangerous job in the grocery store at this point. She loads up my car. She's cheerful. We exchange a few words through our masks. And then she closes the door and I drive off. I wish I'd gotten her name. I might have to go back and do that. And I don't have the whole story, but I can pretty well picture what's going on here. First of all, it'd be really easy to send out your most junior person to do this job. But no, a department manager is doing it. And a good leader probably said, "No, I'll do that. I want to do that. It's the right thing." Again, these examples of leadership aren't just the glorious examples in crisis time. It's the day-to-day leadership that's so important too. Delegation. I don't know, I'd be curious to know again, how many of you recognize the people in this photo, in these photos? On the right is, at this point, Major Dick Winters, airborne troop in World War II. On the left is Damian Lewis, who played him in the HBO series Band of Brothers. This is an outstanding series, if you haven't watched it, on leadership in so many different aspects and how leadership develops. Following this unit from training through stages of combat to the end of the war, it's an outstanding study in leadership development, growth, and leadership failure. But anyway, enough plug for HBO. On delegation, you don't, and in fact shouldn't, do everything. Even in a crisis, delegation is vitally important. One, it lets your people grow. It gives them a great opportunity to show what they can do. Two, it helps you as a leader manage your bandwidth and your task saturation, which are always a problem. But you have to remember that you can't delegate responsibility without delegating authority and independence also. If you tell someone to go do something and then you're constantly looking over the shoulder, you've defeated your purpose. Closely related to this is, prior to a crisis situation, any good leader is always training their replacement. It's obviously necessary in the military world where combat action or just a transfer can take you out at any moment. So the military is constantly in the business of training the next generation. If you don't, your unit, your organization, whatever, faces potential collapse if you're suddenly out of the picture and there's no one who's been trained to take over. Yes, it's sometimes easier for you to do the task rather than delegate it yourself, but you can't do everything. And again, it's not always the right thing to do. If you feel like you can't trust your subordinates to make good calls, then you have a problem. And it's just as likely that the problem is with you as it is with them. And that takes some very careful self-examination. At the same time, when you're in a crisis situation, you should always be keeping your eyes open for these emergent leaders. You'll spot them. They're the people that are picking up, they're rallying the troops from a non-formal leadership position. They're volunteering to take on the tough jobs. Those are the kind of people that you give a situation to. So back to Band of Brothers. One of my favorite scenes from it, as far as leadership examples go, is this unit is assaulting, or Major Winters is now a battalion commander. So his original unit, a company, is a subunit. They're assaulting a village. The assault isn't going well. The commander, the lieutenant in charge, is catatonic. He's out of it. So the unit is pinned down. They're not moving. They're taking casualties. Winters, knowing he knows how to do it, starts to run in and take over. It happens that his regimental commander, a colonel, is standing next to him and orders him not to go. It's not his job to take over that subunit. So Winters pivots to his nearby best lieutenant and says, "You go in there and take over." He does. The attack resumes and finishes up successfully. A key element of realizing and seeing someone realize that, no, there's a time and a place for that, and this isn't the time for me to jump in and do that lower level leadership job. There's plenty of people capable of doing it. Okay, communication. It's a huge field. For now, all I'm going to say, the main thing I want to say, is be yourself. None of you are a good enough actor to not be yourself, especially in a crisis situation. It's just too hard to do. And insincerity will be detected and will kneecap you. So play to your strengths. I've mentioned multiple times that I'm an introvert. I'm much more comfortable talking in small groups of people than to working a crowd, so to speak. I've learned to work in front of a class or a seminar like this through long practice. As a wing commander and base commander and an introvert, I was quite comfortable being behind my desk most of the time. But I had an outstanding, what's called my senior sergeant, Command Chief Master Sergeant Priscilla Leger. And she did a masterful job of periodically coming into my office and saying, "Sir, come with me. We're going to go give this unit some TLC." She knew when a unit needed to see the commander, and she knew how to come get me and put me there and get talking with folks. Someone like that, who complements whatever your personality weaknesses are, is vital and indispensable to being a good leader. It's not all you. So now I want to follow this up. Well, let me briefly say one more thing. Communication is a two-way street, and most of a leader's job is listening, not talking. And along with that, you need multiple sources to tell you the pulse of your organization. I had Chief Leger. I also always had inspector generals that I could trust. A lot of people don't like inspector generals in government or the military. I loved them because they're your complaints department. They will know before anyone else in your unit does, except maybe your chief, when there's a bad trend developing. And the one time I came close in my career to firing a military officer from their position was when I had an inspector general that I didn't trust would bring me the bad information I needed, the bad news I needed to hear. Now, he was saved by a full colonel taking him under his wing and training him up intensely. But you just can't go without those vital feedback sources. So let's listen to a really great, brief bit of communication.
I received His Majesty's commission
I'm going to
to
advance
form
it
a
just
new
little bit.
administration should be necessary to act. I would say to the House, as I said to those who have joined the government, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We have before us an ordeal of the most grievous kind. We have before us many, many long months of struggle and of suffering. You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us, to wage war against a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory however long and hard the road may be. For without victory there is no survival. Let that be realized. No survival for the British Empire. No survival for all that the British Empire had stood for. No survival for the urge and impulse of the ages that mankind will move forward towards its goal. But I take up my task with buoyancy and hope. I feel sure that our cause will not be suffered to fail among men. At this time I feel entitled to claim the aid of all. And I say, come then, let us go forward together with our united strength.
So, an example from one of the greatest English language orators ever, Winston Churchill, just after he's taken over leadership of the British government in the early phases of World War II when they've been kicked around pretty hard. What do I hear in this very brief excerpt of a very brief speech? Key aspects of leadership and crisis communication. The first is a realistic assessment of the situation. He doesn't sugarcoat it. Second is his commitment. It's evident throughout, but it's specifically in his stated commitment to the cause. His explanation of why this is so important, why the cause is important. His inspiration and motivation. It's obvious that he's working hard and he's leading by example. He lays out the policy and the goals in broad terms. And he finishes up with a call for unity. There are common similarities among most of the great leadership speeches. And as an example, I'll just cite one other, the Gettysburg Address, which we probably all learned in school. Also a brief but to the point speech that lays it out in a great way. People forget that before Lincoln spoke that day, the more famous speaker of the time gave I believe, a 3-hour speech that nobody remembers. That's an important lesson. So, the last actual principle I want to cover before we take a conscious pause to hopefully get some questions. I've got one more slide after this actually, but we'll get to that. Never stop learning. Again, I've already stated that I've just recently got a new burst of motivation and learning on leadership from Dr. Woodruff. You should never stop learning. If you are comfortable and confident with where you are and content as a leader, you are seriously messing up. Keep your eyes and ears open all the time. There are great leadership examples all around you in day-to-day life. From the TV to those around you at your work, to your family members. You do this already, whether you realize it or not. Even if you haven't consciously thought about a leadership style or framework or philosophy, you've built one. subconsciously based on your experiences and what you see and hear. I'm just telling you, put more conscious thought into it. Study in a way that works for you. I'm a reader. I've got a huge bookshelf of history and leadership examples that I have worked and studied on. But what works for you? You know, movies are perfectly fine if you're going into them with the right attitude. Learn however works best for you. And learn from bad leaders as well as good. I know starting out in the Air Force, you know, as a line bombardier navigator in B-52s, you'd get a new squadron commander every 18 months or so. About half are good, about half are bad. You still learn something from every one of them. It may be, oh, I'll never do things that way when I get to be a commander, but you still learn. Look at your peer group too. This gets overlooked a lot. But when you're in a quandary, your peer group can be a great resource, just in water cooler discussions or such of, hey, has anyone ever had to deal with this? You'd be surprised at how much wisdom you can get back from your peer group, as well as your subordinates. Remember my chief master sergeant? Yes, I outranked her by, 6 steps, I guess, at the time. But she had more time in the military than I did, and a lot of wisdom. Find a mentor or a hero. Preferably real, but fictional is good too. But a mentor that you can actually engage with and have discussions can really amp up how much you learn on leadership. More than one's even better, but someone that you can go to with quandaries that you can just sit and listen to talk about their experiences, it's invaluable. And so now I just want to cover briefly one more thing. It's not exactly a leadership principle, but I want to talk briefly about black swans versus linear thinking. And the reason is that understanding this aspect of how the world works can better equip you to deal psychologically with the sudden shocks that crises bring. Because it's that sudden shock of a crisis that usually first puts people on their heels and makes them feel overwhelmed. So very briefly, and come back with more questions if I go through this too quickly. But we as human beings are hardwired to think in linear terms. If something changed by this much last year, it's going to change by the same amount, but more next year. That's linear thinking. We in our own mind make predictions on the future in linear terms. It's just hardwired. Back when you were looking for how to find your next meal on the African savannah and worrying about not being eaten, linear thinking was an evolutionary advantage. It takes a lot less computing power to formulate a decision and act on a linear model than it does on an exponential model. By contrast, nonlinear is anything that's not a straight line. So exponential growth, like you see in the early phases of pandemic or virus spread, is nonlinear. Hard discontinuities are nonlinear type of event. Think of a turkey on a turkey farm. Life is good. Hey, you know, I'm getting fed regularly, all I can eat. I'm with my buds day in, day out. I have every expectation linearly that the next day is going to be the same. It's just as good. I'll just get a little bigger. Until one day you're sent to the turkey processing factory and you experience an abrupt discontinuity or nonlinearity when your head is removed from your body. That's a black swan. There's a good book, which I have at the end of my reading list on this, and another one on how your brain serves up to you seemingly logical thoughts that aren't. And that's one of those important things in knowing yourself. Now, know thyself goes all the way back to Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist and philosopher. It's been repeated many times through the ages. Socrates also was an originator of that phrase. So I want to pause there, look at the chat, and open it up as needed for questions in whatever form you want to give us or whatever form Lewis and Miles think they want to feed questions to me.
Yep, everyone feel free to use the chat feature. If you prefer to speak up, just use the raise hand feature in the participants tab, and we'll be monitoring that.
And let's see. Okay, here's a good counterpoint. Today's pandemic can't be considered a black swan event. Experts in the unclassified realm have been pointing it out for almost 2 decades. Yes, that is a good point. And actually, I'll still maintain my point, and that is that a black swan is an unexpected event to the people experiencing it. And that's the case for most folks in the world. Yes, I've been in on the high level government planning for well over a decade, trying to anticipate and plan for a pandemic, but it's not out in the general world. The same thing goes for most black swan events. You can have stock market crashes or whatever, that yes, there's always someone that predicted it, but for the whole, it's not necessarily that way. And so it's an unexpected event, unpredictable event to you or to your organization or whatever. That's a good starting point. I appreciate the counterpoint. What else do we got? Let's see here. You may be covering this in the second half, but I was wondering how you work with folks when your leadership principles clash. Not necessarily one that is right or wrong, but just different. Well, that's a fair point. And that's where that can be a tough one to deal with. Frankly, from a personal perspective, if your principles or core values don't align with the organization you're in, you probably need to be looking for a different situation. Having a tension of conflicting core values or principles can really be a problem. You know, how many people go into a career field because they think they're expected to and to make money, but that's not what they value. They're miserable forever until they finally realize it and change to something that makes them happy. At the same time, you know, you have a responsibility of trying to bring that alignment into being. You know, if it's a large organization, you've obviously got widely disparate people. But putting forth what your organization's core values, explaining why they're important and such, can do a lot to bring people together. And if it's a fit that's just causing continual friction, you're gonna have to do something else about it. Good question. More. I'll give it a minute to see if anyone wants to ask something rather. Don't be bashful. Here's one. How do you handle a situation when your designated leader isn't leading? And at what point can you step up? Excellent question. Yes, that's always a highly situational call. Now, I've been in situations like that. In fact, in one of my deployments to the combat zone, it was the first for the person who was supposed to be the squadron operations officer, if I remember right. He'd never been in combat. And just the thought of that possibility pretty much locked him up. And myself and others basically had to stand right next to him and tell him what he needed to do, when he had to do it. At least for a short term, we got a replacement pretty quick because it was obvious that he wasn't going to hack it under those conditions. But you do what you can. First of all, in situations like that, you will tend to see the emergent leaders step up. You should be looking for them. And in any chain of command, there should be pressure relief valves, so to speak, such that there's some avenue to where you can go to your boss's boss and let them know that something's not working right. If your organization shoots the messenger in those cases, that's another clue bird that maybe you're in the wrong organization. The military has multiple ways to pass that kind of information around. And as a good leader above a bad leader, you should be pretty attuned to if someone under you is not living up to the responsibilities. Let's see. Okay, multiple questions are coming in now. I'll answer probably a few more and then keep going and save the rest for the end of the session. When we're done today, I'll stay online as long as possible and keep answering questions for anyone who wants to stick around. So, going in order. Leaders who are in a leadership position tend to be very busy. How do you recommend approaching folks like this to enter into a mentorship relationship with you? Very good. These are really good questions. You know, it's, again, you've hit one nail on the head, which is that time crunch. But I'll tell you this, a good leader pretty much universally appreciates being asked to be a mentor. And up to a fairly high limit, they will bend over backwards to answer that call. So a quick little verbal exchange, stating your desire to improve yourself. Would you be willing to talk with me some? You don't have to ask for a long-term commitment right up to that, or an email saying the same thing is a perfectly reasonable way, I think, to initiate that engagement. Some organizations and a lot of the military have formally designated mentor relationships. Personally, I haven't seen a lot of success on those where they're kind of dictated by regulation. It's a lot better to let people find that person they're comfortable with, both up and down. What do you think about Captain Crozier's situation on the aircraft carrier? My thought is that he did what he needed to do for his soldiers, or in this case, sailors, and the Navy did what they had to do to maintain order and chain of command. I would love to hear your thoughts. That's a tough one. Now, bear in mind, the huge caveat right off the bat is we don't know the whole story. I'll give you my estimation of what I think based on the limited amount of information that we have. Any reasonable commander is not going to go widespread with a letter like that until after he has tried unsuccessfully to work through the chain of command. So I would not be at all surprised to find that, yes, he had been asking for help through command channels. I don't know that. That's just an educated guess based on my experience. But when that doesn't work, you do what you have to do. Again, back to those early leadership principles I talked about. The safety and security of your folks is your highest responsibility. I took that extremely serious as a commander. And my greatest achievement in life is that I brought back everyone I took into combat safely. There's just nothing that compares to that. Okay, so, you know, again, there's a lot that we don't know yet about this situation. It's gonna be very interesting that the Navy has already recommended reinstating him. And this is gonna be fascinating. There will definitely be books written about that, just as there will be, this pandemic will be studied for hundreds of years in the future. There has never been a worldwide experiment like we're going through now with the amount of analysis and data that we're gonna have after the fact. Okay, last question before I move on. Using a military example, Crozier and Modley, however you pronounce that, how do you balance chain of command needs of the group with the needs of the group you're leading? Well, you know, that's the $1 million question. That's why you get paid the big bucks as a commander. You know, sometimes you do have to put your people at risk. It's a matter of what are the mission needs, how important is it, and is it worth an elevated risk level? You know, if we were at war, a shooting war with a near peer power at this point, you can't shut down your aircraft carrier. People have to work through it and carry on the fight. So the situation, it's highly situational dependent. But that's one of those things where the commander on the spot has to make the call, and they have to be backed up within all reasonable bounds by the command chain. Being second guessed as a commander is the way to completely undercut a command and a whole organization. So good questions. I know there's at least one more in the queue, but I want to keep the pacing going. These are great questions, and I hope you'll hold on to them and ask more even when we finish the next section here. So with that, I'm going to return back to the screen, and we'll move into the phases, the time sequence of a crisis and the aspects of leadership that emerge at different points there. And a lot of this, as you'll see, is not the actual crisis and leadership in a crisis. It's all the activity before and after that set the stage and enable much better performance and leadership during the crisis. So if you're just showing up to a crisis and going, okay, here I am, what do I need to do? You've already missed about 80% of the effort. So the phases of a crisis. Pretty standard breakdown. You can put more subgroups in here and such, but I look at it as a recurring time sequence of preparation, response, recovery, and review, which is frequently called mitigation. But there are no hard boundaries on these, and you can move back and forth between them. They also don't necessarily have to flow in this circle direction. So I've been in this situation, responding to a disaster, hurricane landfall on the Gulf Coast. And you've responded, you're actually starting in the recovery phase when another hurricane brews up out in the Gulf of Mexico. And suddenly you're back in the preparation phase, or you're actually running multiple overlapping parts of this for different phases of a crisis. So you're running preparation for one hurricane, recovery on another. But an important note, no disaster, in my experience, is ever singular. They are always compound. They always have knock-on effects. So for instance, if it's a flood, what always accompanies floods? Well, fires. Why? Because gas lines break, because electrical systems short out. You also almost always have major environmental spills. Long after a disaster, you have disease problems. You can have all these things going at once to where you're in full recovery phase for the actual flood event and cleaning up debris. You're responding and still putting out fires and repairing electrical service. And you're preparing for the onslaught of likely disease later on. That's an example of all this coming together at once. Or take our present case, a pandemic. But what did you have brewing up even before the pandemic? You had a major oil price war in operation between Saudi Arabia and Russia. Now you throw on top of that the compounding effect of a pandemic, and you get a complete crash of oil prices. The lowest I saw last week for West Texas Intermediate was minus $37 per barrel. Astounding. So the point being, this is a way to look at it, but it's not a straitjacket. So let's look at the first of those phases, planning. The preparation, the planning within preparation, that's what I meant to say. I'm going to start off with a couple of really, really good military quotes on planning, because a lot of people don't think about the planning for crises or disasters. First is, no plan survives contact with the enemy. As far as I can tell, there's multiple attributions. This comes from von Moltke the Elder, a Prussian chief of staff and general from the late 1800s. What does this mean? Well, a plan is developed by one side. But when you're meeting an enemy in combat, they're a thinking enemy. They react and deliberately try to throw off your plans. In some ways, even a virus could be looked at the same way. A virus reacts. It'll react in the future to vaccines or things that are used to kill it. Witness all the super bugs that have evolved as we've treated them with penicillin and other strong antibiotics for decades. So, no plan survives contact with the enemy. Closely linked to that is one of Eisenhower's best sayings, which is, plans are worthless. Go back up to no plan survives contact with the enemy. But planning is everything. I love that. Plans are worthless because, again, they fall apart once you meet the enemy. You cannot plan for every contingency. But the planning is so vitally important to any crisis because it forces you to think through actions, to assess your resources, to do some contingency planning, at least on the major branches. If they do this, we might need to do this kind of thing. Going in cold without any planning, awareness, or training just makes everything needlessly harder in a crisis. Related to that, Another part of your planning is forming your teams. Any organization should have teams ready to go. Your mission essential or your crisis action team is your core, generally your core leadership, your top level, your C-suite. They're the first people back in action in one way or another after an emergency, after the most dangerous part of emergency is passed. And then you also have your functional teams. These will be teams like your IT or your finance or whatever. And it may not be those entire departments, but it's the essential parts of those departments to get things actually up and running. Those need to be at least formed up in advance, but they also need to be flexible also, just like your planning. So do you take into account, Bob is a single parent. In a crisis, he may not be able to drop everything and come in and lead the reentry. Who's your backup for that? Or, at any one time, anybody might be on vacation out of the country and get stranded and not be able to get back. Who lives 3 hours away and can't react on a moment's notice to come in and reset the servers, for instance? So all those kinds of things need to be factored in. And then the communication. This communication, I mean, how do you get the essential information and directives out to your teams? Well, in the military, at least in the Air Force, we had what were called recall rosters. So those are, back when I was in, a sheet of paper with everyone's phone number, email, and physical address on it. What's one of the other compounding effects, at least in natural disasters? Well, you typically lose your phone and internet, at least for a while. You may need to have everyone's physical address so you can send a runner to communicate that essential information to come on into work or don't come into work or whatever. So all those things need to factor in. Who's a reserve paramedic or a reserve sheriff? In a natural disaster, they're probably not going to be available to you. And then the final thing on this stage of the planning is your trigger points. Again, part of the planning is, what are those triggers to make us do X, Y, and Z? What's the trigger to say, okay, I need to stand up my crisis action team and plan for backing up and securing all our essential information? Well, it might be a predicted flood event tomorrow where they're estimating there will be 24 inches of rain. Another example of all of this, of planning in teams. Say you're, again, a single parent. You've got kids, 3 kids, 5, 10, and 15. What's your trigger point for reacting to a tornado? Is it a tornado watch? Yeah, maybe not. That might be overreacting. Is it a tornado warning? Probably so. That means there's an actual observed tornado somewhere nearby. What are your teams? Well, as the parent, as the de facto leader, your job is probably to maintain a broad overview of everything that's happening. So you break up your kids into teams. Your 15-year-old, okay, I would assign them to watch for a tornado in the direction that's predicted to come from and alert everyone if they see anything. Younger kids, you go build a fort with every pillow and mattress you can drag into the bathroom so that we can all come join you in a little bit. That's an example, even at the head of household level, of doing this, of doing the pre-planning, of thinking it through in advance. The point being that the less you have to figure out in the moment, the better and the easier it'll go. And on the planning and preparation phase, I want to talk about gaming. And here's where my inner nerd really screams out. Yes, I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons. I even played it on B-52 Alert as a young officer. But what did it do for me? I'll wait for the laughing to die down. Okay, what did it do for me? Well, it taught me to think in kind of scenario terms, where mentally you can what if passive action and alternate actions. What if we do this and then this happens and then we do that? That's called gaming, and that's outstanding preparation for any kind of situation. And it's an integral part of planning on the military side. gaming provides tremendous return on investment of your time for reaction purposes. And it can be at highly variable levels of sophistication. It can be nothing much more than what D&D is. It can be your senior leadership group sitting around a table and just verbally what-ifing situations. It can get very elaborate. If you're a big organization and have a lot of resources, there are professionals that actually set these things up. It can go all the way to my experiences of flying Red Flag, or the Navy version, Top Gun, which is kind of the ultimate simulation or war game, where you may have 100 aircraft fighting a 3-day air campaign. It is wild and it is tough. In fact, it's great preparation. Red Flag was much harder to be successful in than actual combat flying was for me. So that gave me the confidence and the comfort with fluid and changing situations. So I can't recommend gaming situations enough. I'll give you an example that kind of puts a little bit of all this together. Where was I on 9/11? Well, I was a major in a C-130 flying squadron. And I happened to, again, just like the DC Air National Guard, it was a normal training day. And we go through the same stages. We see, someone comes in and says, hey, an airplane hit the World Trade Center. Okay, we go in and watch it. Then you see another one hit. Oh, crap, something's up. And pretty shortly after that, we get word from our headquarters. It's time to raise the FPCon, or the Force Protection Condition. So that's elevating our security in a unit is all you need to worry about. How do you do that? Well, you pull out these pre-planned checklists. In our case, I think it was FPCon Delta. And you start reading them. Myself as the senior officer there, and the senior enlisted person, the controller on duty, sat down with the checklist and started going through them. And it involves things like locking the doors, checking everyone's ID, all those kinds of things. We get to a point where it says, draw and issue weapons. And I go, I don't see any immediate threats here, and nothing that we're gonna stop with a 9mm sidearm that I see on TV. Maybe I better check. So I call up my wing commander, who's in headquarters about 2 blocks away, and say, sir, we're executing the FPCon checklist, but it says draw and issue weapons. Do you want us to do that? And I remember him kind of chuckling. This is Colonel Walker, kind of chuckling and say, no, I don't think so. That's a good call. That's weighing the risk of a bunch of excited people suddenly drawing live weapons and ammunition versus the threat, which isn't evident at that point. Part of that's the preparation, part of that's the gaming of going through these things in the past and knowing that, yes, there's not a need to blindly follow the checklist. That also comes down to delegation. Giving the, in my case, relatively junior officer, the authority on the spot to call, hey, wait a minute, time out, let's check this. So now we come to actual leading in a crisis situation. These are where people can get easily overwhelmed. Myself included, nobody's perfect. But when you're feeling overwhelmed or you're just completely task saturated, the thing to do is to fall back on your first principles and build up. It's going back to the core values and then the principles built upon that and working forward. What's my mission of the day? Those kinds of things. But it's falling back on first principles. Anytime I've been in a quandary, if I fall back on those core values and leadership principles, it always points me in the right direction for the action I need to take. You never lose sight of that integrity first. So that tells you, I'm not going to try to tell my people something that I hope is true but isn't. I'm going to tell them a realistic perspective. And I've had to deal with that in multiple crisis situations. So you fall back on first principles. In a crisis, many things are more difficult, but there are actually some things that are easier, I think, in a crisis. The biggest of those is that people tend to naturally coalesce in a crisis. People come together. In a crisis, the situation and the need is generally clear. The mission is usually clear. And people will almost always pull together. As a commander, I have had people, when there's a hurricane, for instance, coming down, and I was in charge of a National Guard unit, in tears on the phone pleading to be activated. They did not want to not participate in helping their fellow citizens, even more so than in volunteering for combat. It's that volunteering to help your fellow citizens, to help the organization get through a crisis, which is so strong. But that can be destroyed very quickly with poor leadership. It can destroy the team cohesion. And so those timeless leadership principles can never be lost sight of. The poster that you see on the right is a classic one that in some ways sums up a big part of this. That was created in 1939, just prior to Britain entering the war. You see many versions of it now that start off with keep calm and, fill in the blank here, drink coffee, whatever. But that keep calm and carry on slogan has become timeless. And it really sums things up, I think, in a great way. It's telling you, one, what you need to do and what the mission is. It's saying stay calm and carry on with your duties or your job. Really nice thing to have somewhere around. In a crisis, for someone who's inexperienced, perhaps one of the most shocking things is having to make decisions with grossly incomplete information. That's something the leadership explicitly trains for, and that's decision-making under uncertainty. There is no formula for this, but practice does help. The point being that with time compression, you will never get all the information you want before you have to make a decision. And here's where, if you're a perfectionist, you really need to be careful. Perfect is absolutely the enemy of good enough. In fact, it's the enemy of everything in a crisis. If you are a perfectionist, you need to assign someone, and by the way, I'm an information hoarder. I'm not a perfectionist by any means, but I am an information hoarder. Perhaps it's because I'm a scientist or whatever, but I can sit there and soak up information until the cows come home. And so this applies to me too. But you need to have someone nearby who knows when to jump in and tell you now you have to make a call, and hopefully you can do it. Don't forget that inaction is also a decision. Not necessarily a good one, although in the right circumstances it can be. But it's a default action. And then there's, related to this, freeze the build. Now, I came from flying aircraft, and I spent years in the test world, testing brand new aircraft and prototypes and productions. And when you're testing out a new aircraft, there is quite literally no end to the improvements and tweaks that you can find that need to be done to an aircraft. But if you don't draw the line somewhere and say, look, okay, that's great, hold on to that, but we're going to stop making changes now so that we can get this aircraft in production, you will never get to a finished product. And so there's a lot more I can say in that, and why and how aircraft come into, and major weapon systems come into the service. But the point being that you need to freeze the build. At the same time, just like that checklist and myself on 9/11, you still can't take away that frontline leader. You can't take away the authority and responsibility for them to make an on-the-spot call if the situation dictates it. In the military, that's commonly referred to as the strategic lieutenant, in that we have young people all over the world in very isolated positions. Think of Marines in an embassy, or, in my case, you may have a lieutenant in charge of an aircraft that's delivering supplies to a remote corner of the world. Well, that's a pretty junior person. That's not a general or an admiral or a secretary that's in that position. And they may have to make a call or a command decision that has strategic repercussions for the whole world. But they have to be able to do that. So you freeze the build, but you still have to reserve the authority for people to change when the situation calls for it. In my case, I've had cases where a hurricane's coming into landfall in Texas, and as you're probably familiar with, these cones of uncertainty, again, think of that imperfect information that you got to deal with. One, first of all, it's already broad. So where do you position your forces so that once the hurricane's passed, they can quickly get back in and start restoring critical services or searching for people to rescue. So you got that decision, but it's compounded by the fact that as the hurricane's moving, this cone is shifting position. And I remember I don't remember which hurricane it was by name, but a case where I was having to constantly move people up the coast of Texas towards Louisiana as this cone kept shifting, until finally I had to say, nope, stay where you are, get good rest so you'll be ready to go in the morning wherever the hurricane lands. So let me see. Okay, yep. So back to that essential thing that differentiates a crisis from day to day. It's that time crunch, the time compression, and the associated problems of your bandwidth and prioritization so that you can make the best use of the limited time you have. In a crisis, time is quite possibly your most valuable commodity besides human life. This is the most critical difference during crisis. Everything's compressed, and there's basically a need for everyone involved to either lead, follow, or get out of the way. Someone who's just frozen just has to be moved aside. And this is one of those few times when you don't follow the normal leadership process, I guess, in which that you don't have the luxury because of time of using kid gloves on people, or even in a normal situation, someone's failing, you try to give them some mentoring or some training. Yes, you can try to do that in a crisis. It may be nothing more than a 3-word phrase or something. You can try, but you don't have the luxury of letting them learn nice and slowly. So that's one of those few things, leadership principles, that does change. Now, that's not to say that you don't maintain respect for everybody. Someone who's frozen up in a crisis, you don't blame them. For whatever reason, they weren't prepared, they weren't trained, it may well be your fault. You still show respect for everybody, even in the midst of a crisis. It's also very easy to fall back on your technical specialty. Almost all of us, if you're in a leadership position, especially a senior leadership position, you've gotten there by being really good at the jobs in between, at the jobs on the way up. It's a very common failing that I've seen in the military, that people their comfort zone is that specialty they were trained in. So for me, it's being a navigator bombardier on an aircraft. I'd go back today, if I could, into combat as a crew dog. I'm comfortable, I know what it is, I'm good at it. Think of Major Winters wanting to jump back in and take over a company as opposed to commanding a battalion because he knows that job so well. That's his technical specialty. But doing that is not your job as a leader. You've got people whose job is to do those technical details. Along those lines, you are not paid as a leader to make the easy calls. Only the toughest calls should be coming up to your level. If the easy calls are coming up, then your organization, for whatever reason, may have gotten lazy or is scared and is elevating every decision. They're having you do all the thinking. Now that's a failure for multiple reasons. You have to focus on the most important and time critical decisions. And one of the good aids to that, there can be many, is something like this, where you have a risk matrix. This is a very simple one. It's just a 3x3 where you have increasing impact of an event going up and increasing probability of an event off to the right. And you color code it by a combination of the impact and the probability, giving you, low concern, medium, and high. As the senior most leader in an organization, you should be spending most of your time in this red zone. Your next level down should be spending their time in the yellow, and the lowest decision-making level should be focused in the green. Bearing in mind that this is perspective-based. But that's a good way for you to step back and go, well, wait a minute, if you're making easy calls, you should be questioning something. You should be pausing for a moment and go, okay, why did that decision get to my level? So using this risk matrix, you're in a business, it's in danger of flooding out. Your payroll person is beating on your door saying, hey, sir, we've got to get the payroll out. It's due today. But you're in danger of your IT facilities being flooded. Well, looking at this from a risk matrix point of view, it's pretty obvious that the most immediate thing that has to deserve your attention is preserving your critical information for all your business rather than getting the payroll out on this half of a day. So that's an example of how you'd use something like that. Communication. And in this case, I'm thinking more of the tactical communication. It's more the immediate things. And let's tie that back into those core values and an organizational mission statement. If everyone in an organization knows those, what are the core values? What are the leadership principles? What is the organizational mission? Then everyone is in a better position with their own initiative to make the right call at the lowest possible level. It enables better and faster lower level decision making. So this goes back into one of those questions I was asked earlier. You know, it's worth the investment of a leader's time to make sure that everyone does get that. If you just publish your vision statement and maybe you mention it for one sentence once a year, that's probably not doing it. Bearing in mind that I think about 80% of vision and mission statements are not good. If they're more than a few lines long, they're too long. They have to be memorable and succinct. Along those lines, during a crisis is not a time to listen to yourself talk. If you are a talkative person, you know, in some circumstances, that's fine. But in a crisis, you have to be brief and succinct. Otherwise, one, you'll lose people's interest because those immediate issues, those crises are nagging at them. What style of communication are you good at? You know, again, think about that. If you're good at talking to large groups of people, that might be your best way to get critical information out to your organization quickly. If you're better at writing, then maybe a short but well-written email is the best way to communicate what needs to be out. But don't forget that communication is a two-way. One, it's a two-way path, and also it's a loop. So just sending out an email or getting on the public address and making an announcement is not a completed communication. If you don't have some method of verifying that people understood what you're telling them, think back to that young brother and sister. Can you help me here? Yes, I can. I'll bring the stool, those kinds of things. That's completing the loop on communication. And at the same time, you're pushing out direction as a leader, but you darn sure better be soaking the information up on how your organization is performing, what the stress level of your people is, how your resources are doing. Obviously, the material things keep flowing up the chain, but you need to have those paths to collect all that other less tangible information too. And your communication needs to reassure them and show them that there is a light at the end of the tunnel without getting their hopes up falsely. You have to be realistic. People appreciate that. I have never taken a leadership hit from telling my organization the true situation as it stands. And in fact, it just, again, builds your own credibility. So, you know, think back again to Colonel Sasseville. What was his mission direction? 4 words: I'll take the cockpit. That's pretty darn concise. An example in the news currently, I don't know how many of you followed it, we're using Zoom right now. Well, Zoom has been dinged a lot recently for its security flaws. And I don't know all the technical details of this, but one thing I will say is the CEO, I think, did a very good job of communication in a crisis in how he addressed it. In that he came out very quick, in my eyes, very quickly, and said and acknowledged, one, yes, we have a problem. It has caused people heartburn and heartache. We will do everything to fix it, and here's where we stand. I thought that was good communication. I want to show you another bit of communication now. This is probably going to be pretty difficult for a lot of you to follow. Don't worry about it. What I want you to listen to is the tone and style of communication. What you're going to see is a short bit from something that I've actually given complete hours of class on, which is back in 1991, the first Gulf War, Package Q over Iraq. This mission happened to be led by one of my former commanders, and is one of those rare instances in life where you can see, in this case, a very high level medal, a Distinguished Flying Cross being earned. Again, there is a ton, it's almost entirely jargon in here. And so I apologize for that. Listen to the style and tone. A few words, keywords that might help you understand what's going on. One is SAM, the surface-to-air missile. That's the bad guys trying to shoot guided missiles or shooting guided missiles at the guys in the air. Stroke is the call sign for the aircraft in the immediate formation. There's actually dozens of aircraft on this mission, but this is the near term. These aircraft are all single-seat fighters. They're F-16s. Now bear that in mind. You're in a single-seat fighter over enemy territory. There's no one else in there with you. So all the communication, 100% of it is over the radio. So you have stroke 1 is the mission lead through stroke 8 and so on. And then one other thing, when you hear a beep, 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 that is an indication that a SAM missile or a SAM has been launched, probably at you, if you're the aircraft in question here. So with that bit of background, let me play this. And I'm going to move it ahead to the start. Right about there.
Plus one's got a spike.
One other thing I want to say here, I almost forgot this. It might even work best for you if you close your eyes and listen to it. There's so much happening on the screen that it can be distracting. So give that a thought. If not, you can look this up pretty easily on YouTube if you just Google F-16s over Baghdad. So let me resume now. But you're looking at this and you're hearing the audio from one of the F-16s in the formation, in this case, the number 3 guy. And you're looking out the front of his cockpit through what's called his head-up display. So again, let me start it up.
4 deviating left. Picture for Delta. Slits. Picture clean. Fred's tally target is clear. Calling 1.
Collapse target is not clear.
Stroke looks like the target's clear.
Collapse target is not clear.
Stroke 3 visual target.
Lap 3, 42 target.
Fred 1's got SA2 on. 2 on. Lap 4 defending SA2. Stroke 3 defending SA2. Stroke 3, you're on your own.
Lap 1 citizen.
Stroke 3 spino. Stroke 3, cover with me. Has contact. Stroke 3, I'm with you too. 19020.
Jettison egressing.
9020 at 27. No squad.
Lap 5 in.
Slits 4 has those. No squads.
Satisfied. Safe plan.
Let's do confirm sour.
Clap 4, understand, heading south.
That's a firm message to launch.
Was clap 1 heading south.
That one, safe plan.
Let's egress.
He's got his files where you went down.
Copy, bit blind.
Visit your right 5.
Copy that, coming right.
Clap 4 visuals, your right 4. Clap 4 visual. I can picture slits 180 for 12. Clap 4, SE6 Clap 3 safe. Clap 3 spinal.
Got target up strip on the road, but you can see our foundry.
Say again.
Stroke. Stroke 3, come on. Stroke 3, check right, break right. Stroke 3, break right. Sam right 2. Clap 4, confirm your Stroke 3, break right, Sam line.
Stroke 3, break, code 4.
Sam right 3, right 3.
Sam, no.
Wait, somebody got a hit.
Code 4 hit.
Confirm enemy squawk. Understand your hit.
4, negative bad guy squawk, negative friendly squawk.
Clap. flap 7, visual left 9.
Stroke 4 status.
Flap 4 status.
Okay. Rather dramatic engagement. It's actually about the hairiest engagement the U.S. Air Force has had since Vietnam. By the way, in that formation, 2 aircraft were shot down. The pilots were captured by the Iraqis and tortured until they were released at the end of the war. The commander of that mission thought that when he landed, he was going to have his wings removed for failure. But he got the Distinguished Flying Cross for actually doing a superb job of leading his formation through what's called a SAMbush in an engagement that Intel had missed, that all these surface-to-air missiles were there. So an outstanding example. Again, obviously it's kind of hard to follow unless you're really used to this stuff, what was being said, but there was a ton of information going up and down the chain, peer to peer, on what's the plan, what do we do now, you need to do this, we're going to do that, what's the next stage of the mission. A ton of information, extremely concise, and yes, under pressure people's voices go up. I've heard that many times, but they don't lose their cool. They're still talking in short bursts, they're still getting the essential information out. So a really instructive video, and again, I've done a complete hour and a half just on what you can learn from this video, both tactically and leadership wise. So let's move on. You can't forget to take care of yourself in a crisis. Under this kind of time compression, you can reach burnout. Anybody can reach burnout very quickly. It's vitally important that you take care of yourself as the leader. Now, a frontline infantry unit that's in continual combat will eventually reach 100% mental casualties due to the stress. It may be after a month, it may be after several months, but the point being that essentially everyone has a breaking point. Under a crisis, especially without training, you can reach that much faster than you think. It's important that you take care of yourself and your people. If for no other reason than poor fatigue leads to very poor decision-making. There's good studies that show that 24 hours with sleep makes your decision-making ability essentially equivalent to being legally drunk. And besides carving out maybe a 30-minute nap here and there, even if you're on 24-hour duty, another great recharge, in addition to humor, is that venting. And that's why I think as a leader, it's always great to have someone in your organization who you trust and know well enough and knows you well enough that you can vent to them. It's a great stress relief. You reserve that downtime. You carve out even innovation space in a disaster when you can, and you have someone you can talk with. This photo here, for those that don't recognize it, is from a classic leadership study movie called 12 O'Clock High. It was filmed in 1949, but it's about US bomber forces in the early days of World War II, when our bomber forces and the fighters with them were the only folks engaged in combat with Germany, which is prior to D-Day. So 1942, 1943, and most of the first half of 44, it was pretty much entirely an air war in Europe. And the brunt was borne by the bombers, who had casualty rates as high as infantry units. It was very bad, and your chances of surviving what started out as, I think, a 15 and went to a 25-minute combat rotation, combat tour, were not very good. But the burden of command, that stress of leadership, which is can be even higher than the individuals involved, is tremendous. And this movie, which you can find in multiple locations, is well worth a watch. If for nothing else, I love great black and white cinematography. It stars Gregory Peck, and it examines the stress on the commander of a bomber group in these early days of World War II, where they're taking tremendous casualties, but they have a mission that has to be done. And there's a lot of balancing, and how do you balance that mission and people? How do you keep yourself together? Highly recommend it. So now I'm going to move out of the actual crisis and move into recovery. And this will go a little faster here. there's one main point I want to make about recovery. And by recovery, I don't mean, cleaning up the glass from the window breaking. This is the longer term picture of how do you get your organization back and running, whether it's a city, a small business, or a military unit that's just experienced a major session of combat. The point being that recovery is a very different situation and takes a different style of leadership than crises do. It may even take a different person depending on what your flexibility and adaptability as a leader is. And it's one of the major failings from what I've seen in government disaster recovery. Virtually universally, once a disaster is passed, the person that's put in charge of the recovery effort first is usually someone from fire, medical, or police. They are outstanding at crisis leadership. They do it day in, day out. Recovery is more of a program management exercise. It's about relationship building and maintenance. It's about communicating and communicating and communicating. It's a different thing and it requires a different style. If you're flexible enough, that's great. If it's not in your nature, maybe you look for someone else to take the lead on getting your organization back up from that aspect. You can be doing other things strategically while they work on the bringing the organization back up to speed. For a business world example, think of this. How many people do you know that, one, are great entrepreneurs and love starting businesses, but are terrible at doing that sustainment and long-term growth of a business? I can think of multiple national level examples of that kind of thing. The reason is the same thing. It's a different style of organization, a different style of leadership from a startup to a major organization that wants to maintain sustained long-term growth. That's the way to think about that. Okay, so the crisis is over. You cleaned up. Time to go home and rest and get a vacation in. No, not at all. In the military, we have a thing called an after-action review after any significant event. Or in the Air Force, after every mission you fly, you have a debrief, whether it's a training mission or a combat mission. What that is a very honest and direct critique of what worked, what didn't work in the event that just passed. This is perhaps the most important part of doing better the next time around. So I'll give you an example from the Air Force. In the Air Force, you have people from junior enlisted ranks, airmen or low-level sergeants up through colonels and sometimes even generals that one-star generals can fly combat missions. Another significant difference between the Air and the Army is you're flying the lead aircraft easily through being a full colonel and sometimes through being a one-star general. You're in the lead of the combat formation. But the point being that when you get back on the ground, we always have a debrief. And it's not at all unusual for a sergeant loadmaster in the back of the C-130 to tell the formation lead, who might be a major or a lieutenant colonel, hey, sir, on that run-in, you did a brake turn without giving us warning and really slammed us into the wall. Can you not do that again? So, respectful, but clearly pointing out that there was an error made. It jeopardized safety. What can we do better about that next time? And that works in all directions. It's something I'd like to see more of in the medical field. I understand that it is starting to take hold in operating rooms and such, but that critique, where you can at least hopefully, maybe for liability reasons, you can't record it, but you look honestly at how everyone worked, what went wrong, what went right. Don't forget to praise the things that went right and record these so that you can do better next time. And in fact, what you do is you document the significant errors, you assign responsibility for fixing them, and you schedule follow-up reviews of these open items, as we call them, in the future. And so that leads to an ongoing effort all the way up until the next crisis hits of periodically reviewing what happened on the last crisis. But at some point in that, even though you're reviewing that, you need to broaden your aperture out and look at the biggest picture you can. So yes, Okay, we just got through with a major pandemic. But what if instead of that, we had a flood event, or there was a nuclear reactor meltdown? What might we do there? Broaden out your picture and try to think about, well, what about other types of crises that could happen? Think about going back to that gaming that I was talking about earlier. Review your teams. The performance that you're analyzing that just finished may even drive you to tweaking or adjusting your principles. And then don't forget about instituting teaching or mentoring as needed based on what you observed. So that's the phases of a crisis. I'm going to, so that we have some time to still have some more questions, I'm going to go very quickly through what I call the selfie part, or that self-study, or further study on your part. Again, back to my opening line, never stop learning. There are things all around you that can provide good things for you to study on leadership. And here's just a quick sampling of some of the things. I already mentioned 12 O'Clock High and Band of Brothers as being outstanding. There's many others. There's fictional things. Heck, you can look for, I know there's good and bad leadership examples in Mad Men, in all these things, and in the current news, as we already got in some questions. Books, again, because I'm a book person, I really like the autobiographies, because you cut out the middlemen in this, although sometimes you get some self-serving descriptions of things. I mean, Caesar, by his own admission, never did anything wrong. But it's still insightful to see how he thought about how he conducted warfare and led people. Ulysses Grant, one of our greatest generals, was brutally honest in his own autobiography about the lessons he learned in combat, including that cost people's lives. So that's well worth reading. The Black Swan, I already mentioned Black Swan Events. This book by Nassim Taleb really changed my outlook on courses of events, I'll just say that. And then this one by Daniel Kahneman. He's a Nobel Prize winner in economics, but he's a psychologist. And he does a great job in a fairly thick but very readable book of explaining how your brain serves up to you seemingly logical thoughts that aren't. And again, credit to Dr. Woodruff, things like classic literature. I recently rewatched Henry V, and his speech to his men the night before his big battle is really awesome. And again, very similar to Shakespeare, to Churchill and others, lays out the situation. And then there's some others. Close to home, HEB's been responsible, is under contract to the state of Texas for food and water deliveries after a disaster to people in need. They have been a pleasure to work with for a long time, and they have their act together. And there was a recent story on Texas Monthly walking through how they started getting ready for the pandemic weeks, if not a month ahead of most other people in the country. And then one other good one, oh, this is the story about Heather Penny. It was in the Washington Post. But I want to point out to you another recent, I think, great leadership communication, and that is Queen Elizabeth's speech. 80 years apart, she gave very significant speeches to her country. The first in the early stages of World War II as a teenager, talking to the children of England about how they'll get through the war. And then just 3 weeks ago, talking to our country again about getting through the pandemic, sharing their experiences, providing a realistic beacon of hope. Really masterful communication. And then your own self-study. So keep your eyes and ears open. You can learn from everyone around you, good and bad. You can learn from what you see day in, day out on TV, but figure out what works for you and collect, please, many more viewpoints than just mine, and build your own philosophy and framework for leadership. And so I want to close with one last video of an interesting, both good and bad leadership in action, and we'll see what you think of that.
Well done, boys. Looks like ice cold sushi for breakfast. We'll go out for pineapple, my little bubbly-headed boobly-boo.
Skipper, look. Analysis. It looks like a small incandescent bulb, designed to indicate something out of the ordinary, like a malfunction.
I find it pretty and somewhat hypnotic.
That too, sir.
Right. Rico, manual.
Problemo solved.
Sir, we may be out of fuel.
What makes you think that?
We've lost engine 1. And engine 2 is no longer on fire.
Buckle up, boys.
Don't look dull. This might get hairy. Attention! This is your captain speaking. I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we'll be landing immediately. Bad news is we're crash landing.
Okay. With that, I will open it up for any follow-up questions. And let me first back up to one I think that was left over from the last time. Let me double check. Gotta pull back through the chat here, so hold on just a second. Okay, got that one. Got that one. Okay, what are some useful communication tactics leaders can practice to decrease worry amongst team members during these uncertain times? Again, I think, one, that example of maintaining your calm. Two, that realistic and honest communication. If they see that you're being honest with them and you're communicating with them as rapidly as you can when you're learning stuff, that will reinforce their confidence in you and it will settle their nerves tremendously. Again, other things like making sure they take a moment of downtime. There's so many things you could do there, but it's mostly comes down to you being aware and assessing continually what their stress and worry level is. It may involve you asking, hey, how's your family doing? And you find out, oh, you know, they're coping with trying to find childcare for their kids while carrying on their job. And maybe you take some action to help them out. A good thank you for citing Eisenhower. Yep, appreciate that. Here's one. Although I appreciate the analogies with the military life, I'd like more examples of corporate industry in the face of economic or technological disruptions. Fair enough. And what I'll do is I'll go back and say, I can only give you one perspective. Virtually my entire adult life has been spent in the military or in government service or now in the academic world. So I am not the person you want preaching about the technical details of the corporate side of life. But the leadership principles do not change. They absolutely don't change. So, you know, I'll throw it back at you to some degree. Think about how these principles do transfer, but also look for other presentations. Buy HDO. I mean, there's tons of stuff all over the world that you can get access to, and get some other perspectives and build your own framework for this. My apologies for not being able to go deeper into the business world. Analysis by paralysis. Yes, that's a good catchy way of putting that. Didn't mean to put that up there, but oh well. Are we going to get copies of the slides after this presentation? I'm good with that. I'll leave it up to Lewis and Miles to discuss what can be done there. I also hope to expand this to a full day seminar in the fall and eventually maybe even to a full course, but we'll see what develops there. I certainly have a lot more to go harumph about given more time. Oh, yes, I will. Okay, that's from Lewis. Thanks. Let's see. The slide on communication speaks to what I was trying to ask earlier. Said another way, how do you balance communicating to reassure the team, reduce stress, worry without creating false hopes in these periods where so much can be uncertain? Yeah, well, you know, I've said it in a couple of different ways, but let me add a little bit to it and throw out one of my best personal examples. Along with giving the information as you see fit is admitting what you don't know, but communicating that you're doing everything you can to fill those information gaps. So in a situation I was in, we've had a lot of government shutdowns over the past 15, 20 years. Unfortunately, including shutdowns, in my case, of Air National Guard units, which kind of fell through the cracks. So you've got people in uniform serving in the military, and because of a civilian pay budget crisis, they're in danger of being furloughed. Sorry, I got to take a deep breath myself so I don't rant about the insanity of that. But, so you have a unit with 1,000 people in it, although not that many full-timers, but a lot of people in it. They're all worried about, okay, am I going to have a job, next week? Am I going to get paid? It's a highly fluid situation, as you know how these things go in the government when they're working to the last minute to try to pass a budget, or at least a continuation. Also, bear in mind, and this is something I didn't touch on, the rumor mill is the fastest object known to man, or to humankind. And a lack of information will be filled instantly by the rumor mill in your organization. So when we were facing that uncertainty about who's coming into work the next day due to the shutdown, what did I do? Well, I called an all hands meeting, get everybody in the same room, because we could just barely do that with the auditorium, and just laid out what I knew of the situation. What are the facts that I know? What are the things I don't know? What is command or the political leadership working on to do? When will I give them update at the least, or what will I tell them as soon as I hear it? But communicating that honestly and giving an opportunity to ask questions and fill those in. But that openness and honesty never got me in trouble, whether it's admitting a mistake or admitting you don't know something. Again, people will see through BS in a heartbeat, and it's just not something you want to do. Okay, I hope I've answered that question. If not, follow up with me at some point, and I'll do my best to answer on the phone or via email or something. Someone's already looked up or had read the article on HEB. Yes, it's really good. I anticipate some documentaries being done on that. Personal recommendation, Shackleton's biography. Do you mean the Arctic Explorer? I'm not sure on that. Or will those who came in late be able to see a recording of this? I'll again refer to Lewis on that. I believe so. Hopefully this will be archived. Oh, yes, we will send slides and the recording to everyone. So pardon me, I'm reading down. I'm trying to catch up to the current moment on the chat window. Okay. Okay, I think that's everything. I see some thank yous. Thank you. I appreciate it. It's been fun for me, and I appreciate the dialogue back and forth. I'll hang here online for at least a few minutes later if someone suddenly gets a question they want to ask. And with that, thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I hope this has been of some use to you. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks everyone for joining us. Like we mentioned before, we'll send a follow-up email to everyone with the slides and the recording of this session. And we have another webinar scheduled for May, and that's on flourishing in the workplace. And that's, again, kind of based on a one-day course that we lead normally in person, now online. And so we will include some information on that as well. And please, if you have any feedback from today's session, you can respond to the follow-up email with that. And we really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Thank you.
Okay, there is a late question, so I'll keep talking here because as a PhD, I'll give you an opinion on anything. It may not be, have any valid, but I'll always go harumph. So at the talk about gaming, now I want to play D&D some more. Yes, I still do online gaming a fair amount, but it's hard to find people for D&D. Although now under the lockdown, maybe that's worth reopening. Are there any leadership books that you recommend to read? Yeah, let me go back a couple of slides. There are a lot, and in fact, leadership. There are so much published on leadership every year that there's just no way to keep up with it. So, again, you have to rely on some other people to filter things out. So you can rely on me as a starting point, but Google around for great readership lists. By the way, I think my email is probably available at UT or at HDO. You're welcome to contact me for some of this later on or to get a more in-depth list, because I think I have slightly longer lists in some places. But let me go back to, sorry, a little bit of a lag there, to the book list. So here's my starting point. which is, these aren't all my favorites, but there's some of them, and I've talked about some of these already. So Grant and Xenophon, Caesar. This book here, An Army at Dawn, is a really great, and actually it's a Pulitzer Prize winning study on the US Army at the beginning of the land war in World War II. And this is in North Africa, which is the first place we engaged the Axis forces. And it's a really good study of growing good leadership. And by that, I mean at the general officer level, at the general level, growing good leadership through trial and error, people failing, people succeeding, people being fired, given a second chance, all these variations in personality, leadership style, and everything else. Really good study. It's a thick book, but it's a page turner because it's so well written, obviously on winning the Pulitzer Prize. The Mask of Command by Donald Keegan. He's one of the great British military historians. He also wrote The Face of Battle, both of which were bestsellers and are really good studies. Off the top of my head, I'm trying to think of other good ones that pop into mind. There's a very, very hard to find out of print book called, gosh, what is it? Failure into Success or something like that by Field Marshal Viscount Slim that I read at the Army War College that was quite good. There's more. Reach out to me, get in touch with me, and let me see what I can do to dig up one of my more complete lists that I have on book recommendations. Let's see here. Okay. Another question came in. Let's see. As a leader, what have you found to be the best way to motivate staff? You know, as you probably can tell from listening to me, I'm not a flashy person. I'm pretty quiet, left to my own deal. So my leadership style is not a very quick success one. It's definitely leadership by example, setting a good, quiet, steady leadership example with integrity, with follow through, with sincerity. And frankly, that's not one that comes across instantly. One of my issues is that a lot of people mistake my quietness for being aloof or arrogant. So I have to consciously work on that. And it just takes a little bit of time. I took over a wing. One of my greatest leadership challenges that I didn't get to here was taking over a wing. That's equivalent to a brigade in the military, in the Army. But it's a 1,000-person plus organization that is the basic fighting unit of the Air Force. So it has supply, it has transportation, it has security, it has flying units and such. I took over a unit that had a real problem in leadership. They'd had a micromanager and a dictator that was really trying to do all the thinking for everyone in the unit. He'd gotten in trouble PR-wise and politically, and he'd really gone into a bunker state. And the people were gun shy. If they brought up a problem to the previous commander, they would get shot down. It was definitely a shoot the messenger situation. I took over that unit on 2 days' notice from the outside. This is a fighter unit that had switched over to flying the Predator drones. They were engaged in combat 24/7. And here I was coming in to replace their fired commander. And it took some time. It took conscious effort and telling people, you know, getting them to come out of their shell, getting them to realize that I wasn't going to bite their head off. And in fact, I wanted them to bring me bad news. And it involved things like, okay, give me a brief. Tell me what's going on in your unit. And they wouldn't say hardly anything. And I'd say, well, what about this? Well, what do you think needs to be done in that situation? They'd say, I don't know, sir. What do you think? I say, no, that's not my call. You're paid as the commander on the spot to make the decision. Don't look to me to make your decision for you. And it took months of that steady persistence to bring people out of their shell, get them back and used to doing their job and exercising their initiative. And if even that is only, 3 months is only a start on getting it fixed. When I left that unit 2 years later, it was on a good keel, but it wasn't set. So I was very careful about picking the succeeding leadership that understood the need to keep that direction going on a full generation of people until it sets in the unit culture that that's what good leadership is and that's how a unit should run. Okay, I hope I answered that question. That was kind of a roundabout answer. I can tend to ramble at times when I get enthusiastic on a topic. let's see, another great subject matter. Want more? When were you at the engineering building? Oh, you and I, John? Yes. Inspection service. Oh, yes, yes. I am technically in the engineering department, although I no longer have an office in the EER building. I'm now in the Odin Institute, building-wise. I forgot what that's called, PUB. But yes, I remember meeting you up there. I think it was on the 5th floor of the EER. But most of my time is spent out at the Pickle Center, where the Center for Space Research is. Okay.
All right. Thanks, everyone. That's all we have.
That looks like that's it, Lewis. Thank you.
Yeah, that's all we have time for today. But again, thanks for your attention and for your great discussion, and look for a follow-up email from us later this afternoon. Take care, everyone.
And Lewis, I'll look for some blunt after-action critique from you at some point in the next few days.
All right, sounds good.
Okay, thank you.
Take
I'm
care,
out
everyone.
here.